Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Push and Pull, Mohist Dialectic. If you asked Mo Tzu, he would tell you that in studying classical Chinese philosophy, you should simply learn about Mohism and then stop. My statements are adequate to use, he boasted. Using others' statements to deem my statements wrong is like throwing eggs against a rock. Use up all the eggs in the world, and the rock is still here. It's indestructible. This swaggering self-confidence was based on several things: the simplicity and intuitive appeal of the principle of inclusive care, the supposed ease of its application, and the agreement of Mohist doctrine with the priorities of heaven itself. But there was something else, too. The Mohists were formidably prepared to refute criticisms of their ideas. As time went on, they began to produce explicit reflections on this task, which are ascribed to the thinkers we call the later Mohists. In the previous episode, we discussed later Mohist views on epistemology. As far as later Mohist views on argumentation are concerned, the parts of the Mo Tzu called the Canons, the Greater Selection and Lesser Selection, provide lists of definitions, analogies, observations on language, and contrasting examples of arguments that go right and wrong. As with the rest of the Mo Tzu, these chapters are presumably compilations of previously existing materials, with the results being fairly coherent in the case of the Lesser Selection, while the Canons seem more eclectic. Because of their interest in argumentation, the later Mohists have often been credited with developing a distinctive logic. We'll come back to the question of whether that would be an appropriate label for their project. For now, though, we prefer to stick to the name dialectic, since these chapters are so clearly concerned with argument technique and warnings against bad argumentation. If you were going to compare them to something in Aristotle, as quite a few scholars have been tempted to do, the closest analogy would not be the Prior Analytics, where Aristotle develops a technical account of valid syllogisms, but to his dialectical work, The Topics, and his self-explanatorily titled Sophistical Refutations. Thus, the canons include advice for refuting an opponent, as in this passage: if the other side mentions what is so as grounds for taking this one to be so, then mention what is not so and ask about it. No example is provided in this case, but here's a familiar one that would fit the bill. Suppose your opponent is arguing that white horse is horse, and argues that just like any horse, a white horse has 4 legs. You can then point out a difference between horse and white horse, namely that if someone asks for a white horse, they will not be happy if you bring them just any horse, like a brown horse. This shows that white horse is not in fact the same as horse. We recall this notorious example from Gongsun Long to remind you that the Mohists were not the only thinkers of this period engaged in what was called bian, or disputation. But among our surviving texts from this period, none comes closer to offering a general theory of disputation than the Mohist canons and selections. The Lesser Selection even provides a menu of 4 dialectical strategies. Analogy is mentioning other things and using them to clarify it. Paralleling is placing expressions side by side and jointly proceeding. Pulling is saying, you are so, how is it that I alone cannot be so? Pushing is on the basis that what they don't accept is the same as what they do accept, proposing it. As this passage shows, the later Mohists are interested not just in offering proofs, but more specifically in refuting an opponent in debate. Hence the metaphors of pulling and pushing. To pull, yuan, is to use an admission extracted from our opponent to ask why the same cannot apply in our case. And to push, tui, is to force them to accept something they do not, on the grounds that it is the same as something else they have already accepted. To use the argument strategy of yuan, pull, imagine your opponent thinks that horses are animals but giraffes are not, and you disagree. If your opponent accepts that horses are animals because they are living organisms with sense organs and a nervous system, you can pull their argument by asking why this cannot be the case for your view, that is, that giraffes are animals too. Or you could push them by getting them to admit, since they have already accepted that this horse, a living organism with sense organs, is an animal, Why do they say that this giraffe, a living organism with sense organs, is not a noun? The lesser selection spends quite a bit of time cataloging ways that arguments can go wrong, which is also related to a concern with debate. A given argument may be cogent in one case, whereas what looks to be nearly the same argument will be misleading in another case. It's fine to say that because a horse's eyes are blind, the horse is blind, but wrong to say that because a horse's eyes are big, the horse is big. Here, the two arguments differ only by a single word, replacing blind with big, yet we get a valid inference in one case and not in the other. Here we are reminded of the complexity of word categories. In English, blind and big are what we call adjectives or predicates. They are words that tell us more about a thing. But not all predicates function in the same way. Blind applies to a horse's eye, and at the same time, it indicates to us the condition of the horse itself, but big doesn't work like that. Therefore, when we are engaged in argument, we have to be mindful that words belonging to the same grammatical category do not always function in the same way. Here's another example, which for a change does not involve animals. Jane's parents are people. Jane's serving her parents isn't serving people. Her brother is a handsome man. Loving her brother isn't loving handsome man. The distinction between Jane's serving her parents and serving others rests essentially on the meanings of each of the phrases serving parents and serving people. The first phrase, serving parents, refers to acts of filial piety that are appropriately undertaken by children toward their parents. The second phrase, serving people, actually means being in the service of others, in other words, being a servant. The key to their difference lies in the way two or more words are compounded to derive a different third meaning. The word that is translated as serve, shu, in each of these compound terms incorporates different types of service based on the nature of the different relationships. The compound term also explains the second statement about Jane's love for her handsome brother. We cannot infer from her love for her brother that Jane would indiscriminately love any handsome fellow, especially given that the Chinese phrase for loving handsome men, 爱美人, actually refers to sexual attraction. It is clear not so much from the logical structure of this second statement as from the meanings of its compound terms that Jane's loving her brother is not the same as being sexually attracted to men. These examples illustrate the potential pitfalls of drawing parallels indiscriminately, which might arise for a number of reasons, among them being the nature of the Chinese language. More generally, the Mohists want to illustrate that even legitimate arguments may become dangerous as they change direction, fail when taken too far, and leave their roots as they flow, so one cannot fail to be cautious and cannot invariably use them. But the later Mohists do more than just issue warnings. Various positive doctrines can be extracted from these chapters, starting with the basic point that dialectical argumentation can indeed be decisive. Here they may be polemicizing against Taoist views like those found in the Shuangzi, which might be taken to express a skeptical view about arguments. But how to refute someone who thinks that refutation is impossible? By showing that this position is self-refuting. In the Canons, we find the remark, deeming statements all perverse is itself perverse. In other words, anyone who claims that all statements are false is thereby making a statement and thus undermining themselves. Another Taoist idea that may be targeted in the Canons and selections is that nothing is really one way or another in itself. Rather, all judgments are a matter of perspective. Here too, the later Mohists disagree. They believe that we can classify actions or objects out in the world by placing them into well-defined categories. That's the point of the definitions they collected, and also of another significant theme in their writing, namely sameness and difference. As we might almost expect, the Mohists take care to define sameness, and they do so with quite some precision. There are 4 ways in which two things can be the same. First, one thing having 2 names. This is the type of sameness where we would use the word identical. Second, things that are part of a whole. Third, things in a room, which are the same merely in the sense that they are together. Fourth, things that are similar in some significant respect may be considered the same in type. This meticulous classification of sameness helps delineate what we might mean when we say that two things are the same. The final sense of sameness of things being similar in some respect is explained in another canon in the following way: the same is being different, yet both being one in relation to something. In other words, the specific meaning of sameness in this passage is not identity, but a commonality between two non-identical things. Two giraffes lounging on the savannah are one, insofar as they are animals of the same kind. If one of them were a lion instead, which would be very bad news for the remaining giraffe, then they would not be the same in being giraffes, though they would still be the same in both being animals. As the Mohists note, some features exclude one another and some do not. Being a lion excludes being a giraffe, but to use their example, hardness does not exclude whiteness. We've seen these distinctions put to use already. Jane's parents are people, like anyone else, but her serving them is not about her being in their service, as she might serve a master were she employed to do so. All this may seem obvious, at least once the Mohists have pointed it out, but they have good reason for stressing it, because disputation is in their opinion all about sameness and difference. As the Mohists put it, disputation is contending over that and other. The move by the Mohists to delineate things that belong to a category and others that do not is a significant aspect of their contribution to understanding the process of disputation. Their remarks on sameness are mirrored by a list of the various kinds of difference. And there's more. Yet another way to draw a line is to mark out what is possible and what is not. Among the distinctions they draw, the Mohists focus above all on what is acceptable and what is not, 是非. This kind of dispute can take the form of a debate concerning pushing and pulling. One person asserts that their view is acceptable by saying 是. This is like saying, yeah, to all those views that are in agreement with theirs. They may also say 非, which means no, disagree, to deny the views that do not align with their own. The idea of affirming what one believes and denying what one's opponent believes is a major theme in Warring States discourse. It's particularly in the tensions between the Mohists and the Taoists that we see the full force of such affirmations and denials. As Chris Fraser has explained, the Mohists see dialectic as an attempt to determine whether a given meaning applies to a given thing or not. He cites a text from the 3rd century BCE that explains the purpose of disputation, or bian. Those who dispute separate distinct kinds so that they don't interfere with each other, and arrange different starting points so that they don't confuse each other. They express intentions, communicate what they're referring to, and clarify what they're talking about. They make it so that others share their knowledge and don't strive to perplex each other. So the winner doesn't lose what he defends, and the loser gains what he's seeking. The passage goes on to concede that disputation techniques can also be used to trick opponents, but still the right way to engage in dialectic is to clarify matters, not to confuse them. This is what the Mohists were after too. In addition to those warnings about ways arguments can become dangerous and change direction, they propose a method for determining whether a given word applies. We've seen it in action already in previous episodes, the model or standard, like the carpenter's use of a square, or like appealing to heaven as a model for human morality. Tellingly, the Mohist canons define model in terms of similarity. A model is what, things being like it, they are so. They offer the example of a circle, which may be in the mind, in the geometer's compass, or in the form of a circle that has already been drawn and is used as comparison for another circle. One nice thing about this example is that it gets across the objectivity of Mohist standards. Not everything is a matter of perspective, as the Taoists suggest. A circle of any size is circular, even when no one is looking at it, and provides a standard against which we can measure shapes that are meant to be circular. In light of this, we can say that winning in a disputation is not necessarily getting the opponent or an audience to agree with you. It is rather to identify the correct category by which something may be classified. What the later Mohists are doing here could be compared to the early Confucians' ambition, the rectification of names. For both groups, one of the main tasks of philosophical reflection is to apply the right names to the right things. In pursuit of this goal, the Mohists make some strides in the direction of a theory of names. They distinguish three kinds of name: those that are all-reaching, those that name kinds, and proper names. An all-reaching name is one that applies to any object whatsoever, like the word thing. This sort of name isn't going to play any role in dialectical disputes. There's no point to arguing over whether something is a thing, because thing is a name that all things share in common. At the other end of the scale, a personal name, like Karen or Peter, only marks sameness in the sense of identity, not similarity. Like when you say, that guy over there is Peter, the same Peter who prefers giraffes to horses. Such a name can cause confusion, but only because of ambiguity, which is relatively easy to resolve. The Mohists mentioned the case of a dog whose name is Crane, making people think it is a bird when it is mentioned. So disputation really concerns the middle class of names, those that pick out kinds of thing like giraffe or father. You might remember Mengzi stating that killing a tyrant does not count as regicide. The later Mohists would want Mengzi to explain this remark by saying what all regicides have in common, how they are the same, and what distinguishes regicide from tyrannicide, how they are different. As with Gongsun Long's arguments that white horse is not horse, it's tempting to connect these ideas to the question of universals. Is there some real property that belongs to each member that falls into a kind, like giraffeness in each giraffe or fatherhood in each father? The Mohists do not address this question. Perhaps, like Gongsun Long, they were overwhelmed by the complexity of the world and struggled with the issue of how words can reliably pick out the features of things. And this could have resulted in them saying, only in a very general way, that sameness and difference just allow us to group particular items into classes or kinds, which can be seen as relevant similarity groups, without saying how exactly to do this when we're looking at real horses and giraffes. It's been speculated that the absence of abstract universals in Mohism is connected to their failure to produce an explicit logic, which would provide formal rules of reasoning. If they are doing logic, then it is only in the sense that they are interested in the relationship between names and phrases. That's what's going on when they point out that parents are only a small subclass of persons, so that loving parents does not imply loving persons, though loving persons would imply loving parents, which incidentally concisely explains why the Mohists did uphold the value of filial piety. And as we have seen, the inference holds because of the way compound terms function in Chinese, which really belongs to the domain of word meanings, of semantics, rather than logic. There's no attempt here to systematize valid arguments, like Aristotle does in his syllogistic theory. Likewise with invalid arguments. The Mohists provide plenty of bad arguments as warnings, but no general account for types of bad argument or the underlying causes of ambiguity and invalidity. Insofar as that can be extracted from the canons and selections, it is an exercise left to the reader. Thus, it has been commented that the later Mohists were more interested in argumentation than in pure logic. If you find this disappointing, then here are a couple of considerations to cheer you up. First, even if the Mozi doesn't contain truth tables and lists of valid argument forms, it does make some moves that look distinctively logical. Unlike Aristotle, the later Mohists don't actually use variables like individual letters that stand in for terms, as in a proposition like all A's are B's, but they come pretty close, using stand-in expressions like ox and horse, or this and that. This is why they characterize dialectical debates by saying one calls it ox, another calls it non-ox. In the predominantly agricultural world of antiquity, people were presumably pretty good at telling oxen apart from other livestock, so it seems an unlikely topic for real debate. Rather, ox is a placeholder. They may as well be writing one calls it A, another calls it not A. More substantively, some principles of reasoning are clearly identified by the Mohists, as when they write, using those same quasi-variables, that and other cannot both be impermissible, because in all cases, demarcating ox from not ox makes two. In other words, they forbid making a contrary assertion and denial about a subject. You can't say that one and the same thing is both A and not A. Likewise, a study of the definitions in the canons has revealed their impressive degree of systematicity. Never do the definitions fall into circularity, by directly or indirectly allowing two words to be defined in terms of each other, while certain words are undefined basic concepts on the basis of which more complex ones are explained. A second consideration would go in the other direction, by noting that the Mohists' supposed failure to do logic was only a true failure if that is what they were groping towards. But as we suggested in this and the previous episode, they had other concerns. These later Mohists wanted to provide their allies with tools for winning debates against rivals. This goal is occasionally evident here in the added chapters, as with that self-refutation argument aimed against the Taoists, or an allusion to the Confucians' conception of fate. Holding there is fate isn't fate, say the later Mohists, whereas condemning holding there is fate is condemning fate. Here, the Mohists seem to be deploying dialectical tools to mock their opponents. When the Confucians mistakenly upheld a determinist theory of fate, They were not fated to do so, so they have no excuse for getting things so badly wrong. But the later Mohists were not only interested in inter-school rivalry, they also wanted to display the cogency of arguments made in their own tradition. In this sense, the canons and selections are a kind of commentary on the core chapters, devoted to showing that Mozi's arguments were sound. In short, then, the later Mohist concern is usable, workable method, not abstract validity. This brings us back to a point we made last time, that even the more epistemological and, if you like, logical aspects of Mohism are ultimately there in support of their ethics. We learn how to dispute over ox and not ox, to prepare ourselves for the serious business of disputing over righteous and not righteous. Again, this is occasionally clear from examples in the text. We are advised to find a basis for arguing in support of inclusive care, and admonished that even though ghosts are not people, still, one's brother's ghost is one's brother, a case of sameness that justifies performing the sacrificial rites for departed family members. Along the same lines runs the striking observation that inclusive care is the same whether it is for a small or large population, and applies just as much to past and future people as to present people. In this instance, the lack of relevant difference could be used to support not just sacrificing to ghosts, but also action to ward off climate change. Not unlike Mozi distinguishing tyrannicide from regicide, Mozi himself already drew terminological distinctions of ethical importance, as when he said that a punitive campaign is not the same as aggressive warfare. But it was the later Mohists who provided a framework for making such distinctions self-consciously and carefully. In so doing, they showed to their own satisfaction that the great Mozi's statements were indeed adequate to use. With that, we're just about finished with our second major philosophical movement. Having covered the Confucians and now the Mohists, we will soon be turning to the Taoists and asking, among other things, whether it is really fair to describe them, as the Mohists seem to, as thoroughgoing skeptics. But just as we capped off the series on Confucianism by talking to Amy Olberding, so next time we'll be talking to a leading specialist on the Mohists, the aforementioned Chris Fraser. He quite literally wrote the book on this school, or two books actually, one a general philosophical treatment of Mohism, and the other a selected translation of the Mozi. So he must feature in any inclusive, careful series on the history of philosophy in China.